The question is that the motion be agreed to.
Madam Speaker.
I call the Honourable Amy Adams.
Madam Speaker, thank you. So we come this afternoon to the third and final reading of the Reserve Bank of New Zealand Monetary Policy Amendment Bill. And in the spirit of Christmas, I just want to acknowledge that it's the Minister's first piece of legislation that he will have passed as the Minister of Finance, and that's always a big occasion for a Minister, so I certainly want to acknowledge that. And, Madam Speaker, while I'm in a generous frame of mind, I will also just sort of comment on the timing of the bill going through the House, because it has been quite a quick process. We've moved quite quickly through the readings of the legislation, but I know that the Minister wanted to make sure the rules were very clear heading into the next MPS. So for this side of the House, we acknowledge that it's useful for the Reserve Bank going into next year's monetary policy statements to know exactly what the framing is for that. So that's the bouquets. Now on to the brickbats, because, Madam Speaker, this isn't a piece of legislation that this side of the House can support. We made it very clear to the Minister that we wanted to see if we could find constructive middle grounds, because I do think something as important as the Reserve Bank legislation, the rules under which our monetary policy is conducted, should actually be bipartisan, enduring frameworks. And I mentioned in my last contribution on this bill at an earlier reading the words of Sir Michael Cullen, who actually made the point himself of how important it is that something like the Reserve Bank legislation should be progressed with bipartisan support, because it does need to be enduring and stable. This bill doesn't do that. It doesn't have that support. And I think, therefore, Madam Speaker, there is an enduring question over the very enduring nature of these reforms. The Minister, in his third reading contribution, referenced the purpose of the legislation, and that's something I wanted to turn to as well, because the purpose, as amended by this legislation into the Act, does include a new framing, which actually, oddly enough, this side of the House thinks is quite a useful representation. Our concern is that that purpose isn't then given effect to in the rest of the bill. So the purpose, as the Minister noted, talks about the reason for the legislation being to promote the prosperity and well-being of New Zealanders and contribute to a sustainable and productive economy. Well, all good stuff. We think that's a very useful framing, and yet, if that is the Minister's intention, if he was truly concerned about reforming the Reserve Bank legislation to contribute to a prosperous and successful and productive New Zealand economy, why has none of that been picked up in the economic objectives, which is where the rubber hits the road in this legislation? Because the economic objectives, for those playing along at home, is fundamentally the mandate. So when we talk about this new dual mandate, it is the economic objectives that set that. That is the writing instructions to the Reserve Bank. This is what we, the Parliament of New Zealand, want you to achieve. Now, you would think what we want the Reserve Bank to achieve should be pretty similar to the purpose of the legislation, but unfortunately not. All the mandate or the economic objectives ask the bank to do is not to concern itself with prosperity and well-being of New Zealanders and a successful and productive economy. No, instead it pulls out simply one aspect that goes into that basket of economic objectives and says just focus on employment. And I think, Madam Speaker, that is at the nub of our concern on this part of the legislation, that while the Act and the Minister has talked the bill and the Minister have talked a good game in the purpose clause with framing that we support, none of that has been followed through. So again, we're seeing more big, good-sounding words from this government, but the action being far a very, very different story. Madam Speaker, the Minister in his contribution today also tried to tell this House that actually lots of countries have this sort of dual mandate. We're not unusual at all. And actually, I think he was he left the House with quite a, incorrect understanding of that position. Because while it's true to say that other countries don't simply have a singular mandate, or some other countries don't have a singular mandate, I can tell you that most countries where they have other parts of their mandate don't simply pick out one piece of the economic puzzle. They include a range of things to get that whole flavour of what economic prosperity, well-being and a productive and successful economy look like. And the Australian mandate, which the Minister referenced, is a very good example. It talks specifically about the prosperity of Australians and raising the economic success of that country. They haven't just picked out one single thing and say, while we say we care about the whole economy and prosperity, only turn your mind to employment. And therein lies the real nub of the problem. I mean, the bank has told us on many occasions that they already consider the wider economic situation, and yet the legislation tells them to stop doing that and look at employment. That's the one to care about. And, Madam Speaker, that's why we certainly can't be supporting the legislation. The other part of great concern is, and again I have to reference the Minister's contribution, because he said the bank will continue to make its decisions independently. Well, unfortunately, that's simply not the case. What the Minister is doing through this legislation seriously erodes the real independence of the bank. Because now, of course, you have not only the Minister determining who the Governor and the Deputy Governors are who make up the majority of the committee, not only does the Minister effectively appoint the board of the Reserve Bank, the Minister will now also appoint all the remaining members of the Monetary Policy Committee. And those members face the Minister's pleasure as a determinant of whether they stay in their jobs. So I'm sorry, nobody can tell this side of the House that that isn't going to see the Reserve Bank much more closely tethered to the political whims of the government. And I don't care which government or what sort of government we have in New Zealand, the Reserve Bank should be free to act independently, to criticise the government of the day, to disagree with Treasury. And I can tell you now, mark my words, Mr Speaker, you will suddenly see the Reserve Bank being far more in lockstep with Treasury. That's what this legislation will do. Not only are you going to have the senior Treasury, the Secretary of the Treasury, sitting in the meetings, undoubtedly directing the debate and ensuring that the Reserve Bank pull in the same direction, you are going to see a lot less of the Reserve Bank coming out and disagreeing with the government, calling the government out on bad economic policy, calling the Treasury out on pandering to the government, and that, Mr Speaker, I have no doubt is what this legislation is really designed to do. There was no problem here for the government to fix. No one in New Zealand was calling out for an overhaul of the Reserve Bank legislation. Be under no doubt, this is about the Labour-led government exerting control over one of the few truly independent economic organisations in this country to reduce the risk of the Reserve Bank calling them out for poor, badly formed, negative policies that are going to hurt the New Zealand economy. I have no doubt at all that that is what we're going to see happen. Mr Speaker, while we're hearing all sorts of blowhards over there blowing hard, the reality is exactly that. Now, the Minister said that this has widespread support of the community. He clearly hasn't read the submissions to Select Committee, because the submissions to Select Committee were very clear. They didn't support the dual mandate, and they were worried about the lack of independence of the Reserve Bank Board. So for Mr Jones, who wants to barrack and prevaricate and shoot off from the lip on something he knows absolutely nothing about, which is like most of his portfolios, Mr Speaker, the submissions to the Select Committee made it clear they do not like this legislation. There is no problem that needs to be solved here, and the Minister, in saying it had widespread support, shows how out of touch he is. A year into the term, and we're seeing the sort of arrogance and belief that only those people sitting over there know anything about what needs to happen should deeply worry this country. What I'm deeply worried about this afternoon is we're seeing the eroding of a central plank of the New Zealand system, as we're going to continue to see, because this government doesn't want to be held to account. Instead, they want to neuter the very organisations whose job it is to hold them to account. We don't support it, Mr Speaker, and I will not be voting in favour of this legislation.
Mr Speaker.
I call Michael Wood.
Mr Speaker, very pleased.